Hey guys, tonight we sink back into the deep past, a place where comfort means nothing and survival means everything. Imagine the world before electricity, before the hum of machines, before even the idea of a matchbox. You're crouched in the damp cold of the Stone Age, where a shiver could spiral into death if you didn't figure out how to pull fire from stone. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke without heat, your fingers numb, and your only chance is to make sparks dance. You probably won't survive this, but let's give it a try anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I'm always curious how far this little campfire of ours reaches across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hold a rough piece of flint in one hand, a hunk of iron pyrite in the other. The strike is sharp, sudden, one spark, then another. It feels anticlimactic at first, like fireworks that refuse to catch. But in the dry cradle of cattail fluff or shredded birch bark, those sparks mean everything. You bend low, lips brushing against the fragile ember, coaxing it the way you'd encourage a child to take its first breath. Suddenly, a wisp of smoke curls, then a tiny orange glow. That is warmth. That is life. Without it, you freeze. With it, you eat, defend, and endure. Historians still argue whether humanity first learned fire by accident. Lightning struck forests, volcanic flows, or sparks from rocks, or whether someone, somewhere, experimented until skill replaced luck. Either way, the story goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus is often credited with mastering fire around 1 million years ago, though some archaeologists push the date further back. Picture them. Not quite us, not quite separate, crouched over glowing embers, their faces orange in the dark. But it wasn't enough just to strike sparks. The real secret was learning what would catch. Our ancestors experimented endlessly. Fungus pulled from birch trees, dried dung that smelled like burnt hay, shredded grasses that curled like smoke even before they burned. In Egypt, crocodile dung doubled as tinder for lamps. Yes, crocodile dung. You can almost imagine someone, long ago, muttering, "Well, let's see if this burns." And it did. You know the saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket? Well, survivalists knew, don't carry all your fire in one pit. A flame was precious enough to be transported. Bundles of slow-burning punk wood, or even resin-soaked torches carried smoldering embers across miles. You didn't just light a fire. You guarded it, protected it, as if it were a fragile animal. If it died, so might you. Modern matches are a 19th century luxury. Before that, even striking flint and steel wasn't guaranteed. Imagine losing your lighter on a camping trip and trying to recreate the bow drill, a spindle of wood spun furiously against a baseboard, hands aching as the cord digs into your palms. The friction heats dust into ember, ember into flame. Ancient survival manuals swear by it, but you, panting, half-skeptical, realize why the phrase trial by fire still makes sense. There's also a little-known trick with ice. Yes, ice. If you carve a clear block into a crude lens, polish it, and angle it toward the sun, you can concentrate a beam hot enough to ignite tinder. It's survival MacGyver style, except this method may date back further than you think. Some Arctic peoples knew it, though whether it was used for survival or just experimentation is debated. Still, picture yourself in a frozen wasteland, shaping fire from the very thing trying to kill you. Fire also meant cooking, which sounds obvious until you realize it changed human evolution itself. Cooking broke down starches and proteins, made meat safer, roots digestible, and calories more accessible. Your jaw shrank, your gut shortened, your entire body shifted to rely on cooked food. Without fire, you wouldn't be you. The control of fire also gave humanity control of fear. Animals that stalked you in the dark, lions, wolves, even hyenas, stayed back from the circle of flame. That glow turned predators into shadows on the edge of vision. But it worked both ways. Fire also drew rivals, sometimes enemies. Archaeologists studying cave sites in Israel debate whether scorch marks show shared hearths or constant struggles over who owned the flame. Even here, warmth was power, and power was contested. And yet, fire wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Ancient burials sometimes included charred offerings, as if flame itself was a bridge to the spirit world. The Zoroastrians in Persia, thousands of years later, would tend fire temples for centuries, never letting the sacred flame go out. The flicker of light wasn't just about heat, it was about meaning. You feel that too, staring into a campfire's heart, realizing it's the same hypnotic dance your ancestors watched, half fearful, half comforted. Think about it. Every time you strike a match, light a candle, or click a stove knob, you're playing with the same forces that Stone Age wanderers fought to master. 1,000,000 years, and the secret remains. Spark, breath, tinder, patience. That fragile glow, once coaxed, becomes something greater. And here you are, in the dark, wondering how close you'd make it if forced back into that age. You cradle the ember in your imagination, feeling the leap from cold to warmth, from silence to crackle. The fire spreads, it grows, it lights the night. You're not just surviving, you're inheriting the very skill that pulled humanity out of the shadows. Without it, history would never have begun. You've got fire now, your tiny miracle of warmth flickering in the dark, and yet it isn't enough. Fire doesn't quench thirst. You sit there, lips cracked, tongue like leather, realizing just how brutal dehydration is. 3 days without water, and your body begins to unravel. So, you need to move. You need to search. And here's the ancient problem. Where on earth do you find water in a desert? The trick is remembering that nature hides clues. You look for reeds, for bulrushes, for any green that dares poke through the dust. Where roots dig, there's often moisture beneath. Some desert nomads taught themselves to follow these plant signals, digging carefully with bone tools, sometimes finding pockets of muddy water just deep enough to save a life. It's messy, it tastes like wet earth, but it keeps you going. And then, there's dew. You wouldn't think tiny droplets could matter, but in the early morning, desert travelers stretched cloths over bushes, letting the fabric drink the dew, wringing it out into mouths or bowls. It feels ridiculous, like trying to sip from a ghost, but those drops add up. Imagine crawling out at dawn, licking moisture from stone surfaces, and realizing this absurd act might be the only reason you'll see another sunrise. Historians still argue whether early Bedouins perfected dew collection as a systematic survival tactic, or if it's more of a myth retold by later explorers who romanticized desert endurance. Either way, dew remains a secret gift, a silent well in the emptiest places. Of course, when in doubt, you trust animals. Nomadic tribes often watched camels, not for their water. Despite the myth, camels don't carry gallons inside them. They just conserve like pros, but for their instincts. Camels shade themselves in certain valleys, knowing the land well enough to rest near hidden wells. Follow the camel's path, follow the birds at dawn, even follow swarms of insects. They all betray water's presence in ways your human senses can't. And here's a trick so forgotten it feels like sorcery: the solar still. Ancient desert wanderers dug shallow pits, placed a container in the center, spread plant matter around it. then covered the pit with a hide or later with cloth, weighted at the middle. The sun's heat drew out moisture, which condensed and dripped down into the container. It's slow, it's tedious, but if you've ever tasted that first trickle of distilled water in the middle of a wasteland, you know patience saves. But not all water saves. In the deserts of North Africa, some pools shimmer with temptation but carry death in every sip. Too salty, too brackish, or worse, teeming with parasites. You learn quickly, clear doesn't mean safe. Ancient people sometimes boiled or strained through woven reeds, but often it was sheer knowledge, passed mouth to ear, that told them which pools gave life and which offered slow poison. You think about the desert itself, stretching like a giant oven around you, and it's astonishing that humans not only survived here but thrived. The Tuareg, for example, crossed the Sahara with such precision you'd think they had GPS locked in their skulls. They memorized landmarks invisible to outsiders, subtle dips and dunes, the faint shimmer of different sands. They also wore indigo-dyed veils, not just for mystery, but to trap breath moisture, recycling every drop the body could keep. Clever, sweaty science, disguised as tradition. There's another quirky one. In Australia, Aboriginal groups hunted for frog wells. Certain burrowing frogs stored water inside their bodies, bloated like canteens. If you were desperate, you dug them up, gently squeezed, and drank. Not exactly polite, but hey, hydration is hydration. The frog lived, you lived, fair trade. Try explaining that at a modern dinner party. And don't forget the debate about desert navigation. Some scholars suggest that nomadic peoples mapped waterholes with song lines, oral routes where each verse recalled not just direction, but essential survival stops. Was it poetry, religion, or pure cartography? No one agrees, but the image of a group singing its way to hidden wells is hauntingly beautiful. The real survival wisdom is this. In the desert, you never trust abundance. You ration, sip, carry gourds slung from leather straps, and guard every drop. Sometimes, water was stored in ostrich eggs, sealed with wax, and buried like treasure. You imagine stumbling across one of those caches, an egg in the sand, filled with life-giving water, a message from the past saying, "I was here, I survived, and so can you." Now, you bend low to the cracked earth, feel the grit sting your eyes, and press your ear to the silence. Somewhere, water whispers, faint, hidden, but there. And you know, if you listen with ancient patience, you just might drink. The desert has spared you, at least for now. You've coaxed water from the dust, swallowed those bitter, muddy sips, and felt your body revive. But thirst quenched doesn't fill your stomach, and hunger gnaws in a way even fire can't chase away. Here's where patience, silence, and an unnerving stillness become your only hope. You don't have a supermarket aisle, only your hands, your wits, and the instincts honed by countless hunters before you. You crouch low in the brush, knees stiff, eyes straining. Every sound matters. The rustle of grass, the click of a beetle, the sudden hush of birds that hints at something larger moving nearby. Your ancestors would have recognized these signs like you recognize a ringtone. The wilderness has its own notifications, you just have to tune in. One of the simplest survival tactics, yet nearly forgotten, is the snare. A loop of sinew or twisted fiber set just right on an animal's path, invisible against the earth. You might set dozens, knowing most will fail. But one rabbit caught in that loop could mean stew tonight. Archaeologists in northern Europe uncovered pits and remnants of such traps, evidence that hunters knew the landscape better than the prey itself. They mapped animal highways in their minds, patient as shadows. But patience is more than waiting. It's disguising yourself. Hunters painted mud on their skin, wore cloaks of grass, or even held branches before them to blur their shape. There's a medieval illustration of a hunter literally dressed as a cow, sneaking up on birds. It looks absurd, but it worked. The animals didn't laugh. They simply didn't notice. Historians still argue whether early humans hunted more by endurance than ambush. Endurance hunting meant chasing an animal under the sun until it collapsed from heat exhaustion, while ambush hunting relied on trickery and tools. Evidence of both exists: stone-tipped spears for sudden strikes, and long chase routes etched into desert rock art. Whichever the case, the lesson is clear: you outlast or you outthink. Sometimes, the tools themselves were masterpieces of forgotten craft. Consider the atlatl, a simple spear thrower that acted as an extension of the arm, hurling darts with far more force than muscle alone. Used by hunters across the Americas and Ice Age Europe, the atlatl gave humans reach. With it, you could strike from beyond the danger zone, where tusks or horns couldn't gore you. And then, the bow arrived, a marvel so effective it changed everything. But before the bow, there was patience. Nets strung across animal trails, pits camouflaged with branches, and deadfalls rigged with precarious logs. Imagine waiting for hours, not with Netflix, but with silence so thick you hear your own pulse. You'd have to, because if you so much as sneezed, dinner bolted. There's a quirky tidbit from medieval falconry. Nobles once carried trained hawks to snatch prey from the skies. But far earlier, indigenous peoples used birds in their own clever ways. In South America, tribes followed vultures, because vultures always found the carcasses first. Let the birds do the scouting, then hurry in to claim what was left. Low effort, high reward. Your hands grow numb from holding still. Your legs ache, but you dare not move. Somewhere in the brush, a hair twitches. You feel that electric pulse of tension. Strike now or starve. You lunge, and even if you fail, you learn something. Survival is less about skill than persistence. Miss 10 times, catch once. That's enough. And when you finally do catch something, fire finishes the job. Roasting not only makes the meat safer but stretches the calories. You eat marrow from bones, chew gristle, even boil hides into broth. Nothing is wasted. Archaeological digs at sites like Starcar in England show piles of bones carved and cracked for every drop of sustenance. It wasn't just about killing prey. It was about using every scrap to make the kill worthwhile. But here's the cruel truth. You can hunt all day and come back empty-handed. That's when your ancestors relied on teamwork. Groups drove herds into narrow canyons, where spears rained down like an avalanche. Some scholars argue that cooperation in hunting, sharing the weight, dividing the tasks, was one of the sparks that lit civilization itself. You can't scroll TikTok alone in a cave. You need companions to survive. So, here you are, crouched in the half-dark, feeling hunger's sharp edge dull just a little with the thought of roasted meat. Silent, still, patient, you join the long line of hunters who waited, listened, and learned to turn emptiness into survival. Your stomach still growls, even after the hair roasted over your smoky little fire. One meal doesn't last, and hunger lingers like a shadow that always follows. You glance around at the empty horizon, and it hits you. Animals aren't the only pantry. Plants were the first, and often the last, fallback. Welcome to the wild pantry, where every leaf, root, and berry offers either salvation or disaster. You reach down to tug at a root with your bare hands. It's knotted, earthy, bitter when you nibble it raw. Edible? Maybe. Poison? Also maybe. This is the gamble your ancestors faced daily. They didn't have glossy cookbooks or FDA labels. Only trial, error, and sometimes tragedy. Historians still argue whether many of the earliest plant use traditions came from accidental discovery, like some unlucky soul eating the wrong berry, or whether ancient communities carefully tested, tasted, and passed down plant lore. Either way, the survival knowledge became as vital as flint and fire. Think about acorns. Today, you might see squirrels going nuts for them, but in ancient Europe, entire communities relied on them as staple food. The trick? You had to leach out the bitter tannins. Some groups pounded acorns into flour, then soaked the meal in running streams until the bitterness washed away. Imagine kneeling at the riverbank, watching your food swirl away in brown clouds, praying enough flavor left behind to keep it edible. And then there were tubers, wild carrots, cattail rhizomes, yams. Some nourishing, some toxic. One quirky survival tidbit. Cattails were nicknamed the supermarket of the swamp. Every part of them could be used. Roots roasted like potatoes, stalks peeled for crunch, fluffy seed heads for stuffing clothes or fire tinder. You almost laugh, an ancient one-stop shop standing in the mud. But there's a darker side to the pantry. Mushrooms. Delicious, deadly, or downright hallucinogenic. Some Stone Age communities painted them in cave art, which has led to endless debates. Did they revere them as sacred, as medicine, or simply as strange food? Scholars can't agree, but you picture a group huddled around the fire, daring each other to nibble on a mysterious red cap dotted with white. Brave or foolish? Maybe both. And berries, always tempting, always tricky. The rule of survival. Bright colors often mean danger. Red? Sometimes sweet strawberries, sometimes fatal nightshade. Blue? Could be blueberries, could be pokeweed. Ancient people developed mnemonics and rituals to test edibility. Some Native American groups reportedly watched birds closely. If a bird ate a berry and lived, so could you. Of course, birds have stronger stomachs than humans, so not always reliable. Still, plant lore wasn't just about food. Take garlic mustard, for example. Found in prehistoric cooking pits in Britain, it flavored meat long before spices traveled the Silk Road. Even then, people craved taste, not just calories. You can almost smell it. Roasted venison with a faint garlicky kick, a reminder that survival didn't mean giving up pleasure. And then, there's the quirky case of pine. Pine nuts were treasured snacks, yes, but resin had other uses. Chewed like gum for antiseptic benefits, burned as incense, smeared on wounds as a primitive antibiotic. You might not think tree sap could save you, but out here, it's medicine, glue, even waterproofing for shoes. You suddenly appreciate every sticky pine cone that's ever clung annoyingly to your fingers. But the pantry had cruel tricks. Starvation seasons forced communities to eat bark, stripping the inner cambium and chewing its bitter strips. Some groups in Scandinavia even baked bark bread. It sounds ridiculous, but it filled the belly enough to keep going. Archaeologists have found grinding stones stained with the fibers, a quiet testament to desperation disguised as cuisine. Historians still debate whether plant knowledge was guarded like treasure or shared freely. Some argue that shamans or healers hoarded the secrets, passing them through ritual. Others believe survival depended on everyone knowing a little. Whichever the truth, the legacy of this knowledge is still around. You take aspirin today, which traces straight back to willow bark tea. Yes, that same bitter brew your ancestors sipped when fevers raged. So, you squat there, chewing a roasted root, spitting out the stringy fibers, swallowing what nutrition you can. It's not glamorous. It's not filling, but it's fuel, and fuel keeps you alive. And as you lean back, licking dirt from your fingers, you realize the wild pantry isn't just about eating, it's about remembering. Each leaf and root carries a story of who risked, who endured, and who whispered to the next generation, "Eat this, not that." You've eaten roots, chewed bark, swallowed bitter greens. Your stomach is quieter now, but survival is never one victory. It's a chain of them, and the next link is shelter. Without it, the wind strips your heat, the rain soaks your bones, the snow smothers you like a cold blanket. Tonight, you need a roof, however crude. You kneel in the fading light, scanning the land. A low cluster of trees, a scattering of stones, maybe a shallow cave if you're lucky. Shelter isn't about beauty, it's about endurance. Your ancestors understood that better than anyone. They didn't design houses for Instagram. They built them to stop death at the doorstep. The first trick is branches. Lean them together in a crude frame, cover them with leaves, grass, hides. Suddenly you've got a lean-to, primitive but surprisingly effective. Archaeologists at Terra Amida in France uncovered post holes and stone alignments suggesting people were building such shelters over 400,000 years ago. Think about that. Before written words, before pottery, before cities, people already knew how to keep the wind out. Snow brings its own lesson. You might imagine snow caves as miserable, but the opposite is true. Dig into a drift, carve out a hollow, and the walls act like insulation, trapping your own body heat. You're cocooned in a cold womb that paradoxically keeps you warmer than the open air. Some survival instructors even argue it's cozier than a tent. Historians still argue whether prehistoric Arctic peoples preferred open fires on the ice or snow shelters with body heat. But evidence suggests both worked, depending on desperation. And then there's the wigwam-like shelters of birch bark and willow frames, or the mammoth bone huts of Ice Age Ukraine. Yes, mammoth bones. Archaeologists uncovered entire rings of them, tusks arching like door frames, hides stretched across ribs. Imagine sleeping beneath the skeleton of a creature you once feared, its body turned into your fortress. Creepy, but also genius. Quirky tidbit. In ancient Egypt, people sometimes coated their houses in crocodile dung plaster for insulation and pest control. You thought the crocodile dung sunscreen earlier was bad. Well, apparently, the stuff was multipurpose. You wrinkle your nose, but admit, if it worked, it worked. Shelter isn't just about keeping dry. It's about signaling safety. A doorway marked where community began and wilderness ended. Even a crude windbreak gave psychological comfort. That's why some archaeologists argue that building shelters wasn't just survival instinct. It was the beginning of home. That shift from wandering beast to rooted human may have started with nothing more than a lean-to that stood up through the night. But it wasn't always about permanence. Nomads needed fast, flexible designs. You lash together a frame, drape hides, weigh them with stones, and in an hour, you've got a portable hut. Tomorrow, you pull it down, roll it up, and carry it. The modern tent is ancient tech with nylon upgrades. You crouch inside your own crude shelter now. The fire flickers at the entrance, smoke curling out through a gap. Rain patters, but it doesn't reach you. The wind moans, but you're wrapped in warmth. You press your palm to the branch wall, feel it tremble with the storm outside, and marvel, flimsy as it looks, this fragile hut is the line between comfort and collapse. And here's a final thought. Every skyscraper today, every apartment tower and suburban home descends from this instinct. The same drive that made you drag sticks together in panic eventually raised cathedrals and castles. The difference is scale, not purpose. You build to live. You build to protect. And tonight, you build because without it, the darkness outside swallows you whole. The walls of your shelter hold firm through the night. The fire keeps its sleepy crackle, but safety is always temporary. At dawn, You step outside and realize the wilderness doesn't rest. It stares back at you with eyes, sometimes friendly, sometimes hungry. Animals, you quickly learn, can be partners or predators, saviors or nightmares. Survival depends on knowing the difference. First, the allies. Dogs. The oldest friendship in human history. Long before cats slunk into grain stores, before cattle were corralled, wolves crept closer to campfires. You imagine them, lean and wary, drawn by scraps of bone. People tolerated them, then trusted them, and in return, those wolves became dogs, watchers, hunters, and companions. Archaeologists argue about when exactly this bond formed. Some say as early as 30,000 years ago, others push it later, but the evidence is there in ancient burials. Dogs curled beside humans, loved as family. Tonight, you're grateful for the faint growl at the edge of your shelter, the sound that warns you of movement in the brush. Then there are birds. In the Pacific Islands, fishermen watched frigate birds to find schools of fish. In deserts, vultures led people to waterholes or carrion. And bees, yes, even bees were guides. Some groups in Africa whistled a special tune to a bird called the honey guide. This bird, astonishingly, led humans straight to hives. You got honey, the bird got the wax and larvae. A partnership sweet enough to sound like legend, yet it's real. You whistle now, half expecting a bird to flutter down and say, "Follow me." But as useful as some animals were, others spelled danger. Wolves before they were friends. Boars with tusks sharp enough to gut you in seconds. Bears, who saw your meager shelter as nothing more than a curiosity. You hear a rustle in the trees, your pulse spikes, and you remember, you are not the apex predator here. Not yet. Historians still argue whether prehistoric humans feared big cats more than wolves. Cave paintings at Chauvet in France show lions in almost reverential detail, suggesting awe, maybe terror. And why not? Without fire, without spears, a lion could silence your entire story in a heartbeat. So you learn tricks. You sharpen sticks into stakes, drive them into the ground around your camp like primitive barbed wire. You scatter ash and rocks to mask your scent from scavengers. In medieval Europe, peasants smeared pig fat around their sheep pens to deter wolves, believing the stench kept predators at bay. Quirky? Definitely. Effective? Maybe. But desperation always invents solutions. Animals also taught you how to live. Watch a deer, and you'll learn where water flows. Watch a squirrel, and you'll find hidden nuts. In Japan, ancient hunters reportedly studied monkey behavior to locate edible roots and fruits. You're not just surviving. You're stealing survival strategies from the wild itself. And sometimes, animals forced humans to innovate. The invention of corrals, of fences, of cooperative hunting strategies, all arose from the need to control or defend against them. A wild herd of aurochs wasn't just dinner. It was danger in stampede form. Teams of hunters drove them off cliffs, a brutal tactic, but one that filled bellies for months. Archaeologists still find the bones in piles at the base of cliffs, grim evidence of ancient strategy. And then, the spiritual side. Animals weren't just food or threat, they were symbols. Shamans wore antlers, cloaks of feathers, claws strung as necklaces. These weren't costumes, they were survival statements. I borrow the power of this beast. Some scholars argue whether such rituals were practical psychology, giving hunters courage or true belief in borrowed strength. Either way, when you drape a wolf pelt over your shoulders, you walk with more than warmth. You walk with borrowed teeth. Tonight, as you sit by your fire, you hear the soft breath of your dog companion at your feet, the distant screech of an owl, the snapping of twigs in the underbrush. Friend or enemy, You won't know until it steps closer. But you do know this. Survival was never just about humans versus nature. It was humans with nature against nature, and sometimes because of nature. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear that balance whispering all around you. The night is quiet, save for the wind, the fire's low crackle, and the occasional rustle in the brush. You imagine how crushingly lonely survival could feel without communication. A single human crouched in the wilderness is fragile. A group is stronger. But how do you stay connected when forests, rivers, or mountains stretch between you? You can't pick up a phone. You don't even have paper. What you do have is ingenuity and a deep need to be heard. You toss a handful of damp grass onto your fire, and smoke begins to rise in thick, curling columns. That's your first survival text message. Ancient peoples in North America, Africa, and Asia all used smoke signals, each group developing its own code. A single puff might mean, "I'm here." Two might mean danger. Historians still argue whether smoke signals were standardized across regions or if each group had its own private language. Either way, a plume on the horizon meant someone was reaching out. The irony, of course, is that smoke meant visibility, and sometimes you didn't want to be found. Closer to the ground, drums spoke through forests. In West Africa, the talking drums weren't just for rhythm. They mimicked tones of speech, sending messages miles away. Imagine crouching in dense jungle, hearing the distant thump-thump pattern, and knowing exactly what it meant. A call to gather, a warning of strangers, maybe even the start of a celebration. Quirky tidbit. Some colonial officers in the 19th century were baffled by how fast messages spread among local communities, unaware they were being outpaced by drums long before telegraphs. But sound wasn't the only trick. In Polynesia, people used conch shells to blast messages over water. In the Alps, shepherds blew long wooden horns that echoed across valleys. On the Great Plains, a mirror, polished metal, obsidian, even just a bit of wet stone, could catch sunlight and flash like Morse code before Morse even existed. It's easy to forget that light and sound have always been there, waiting for us to bend them into tools. And then there's body language. Hunters moved silently through forests, yet they had to signal each other. A raised hand, a tilted head, a finger to lips. All simple, all universal. Anthropologists still debate whether these survival gestures are innate to humans or learned behaviors passed across cultures. Either way, they're older than words, older than fire. You've done them yourself without thinking, and in the wild, those tiny signals might be the line between stealth and discovery. Not all signals were about survival in the strict sense. Some were ceremonial. Paint splashed on stone, handprints on cave walls, carved notches in trees. Were these warnings, wayfinding signs, or early art? Probably all three. Archaeologists at Blombos Cave in South Africa found engraved ochre pieces nearly 75,000 years old. Crosshatched lines that might have been code, might have been decoration. The truth is, they blur together. To survive is to mark, to be seen, to say, "I was here." Quirky example. In medieval Europe, shepherds sometimes carved symbols into wooden staffs, marking how many sheep they'd moved or where they traveled. Those sticks became personal ledgers, a survival account book in bark and wood. Imagine scrolling through your own feed, not on a screen, but in carved grooves. Primitive, yes, but it worked. So you sit by your smoky fire, watching the sky darken, and you think about how desperately humans needed to bridge the gaps between them. Alone, you are prey. Together, you are something more. Communication, the signals and smoke, the rhythm of drums, the glint of a mirror, wasn't just convenience. It was survival itself. You glance at your fire again, at a little damp moss, and watch the smoke rise in a twisting ribbon. Out there, someone might be watching. Maybe friend, maybe foe. But one thing is certain, you are not silent. The fire has burned low, and as the night deepens, you realize warmth alone won't keep you alive. Hunger gnaws at you, sharper than the chill. Without food, your body weakens. Without a way to store it, you're at the mercy of whatever you can catch in the moment. Primitive survival meant not only finding food, but also making sure it lasted beyond the hunt. So you lean forward, imagining how ancient hands solved the problem long before refrigerators. First came smoke, not just for signaling, but for flavor and preservation. Picture yourself in a damp cave, strips of venison or fish dangling above a smoky fire. The smoke clings to the meat, coating it with antimicrobial compounds that slow rot. Native peoples across North America perfected this, building smokehouses from logs and mud, some still in use today. Historians still argue whether smoking began accidentally, meat hung to dry above a fire, or whether it was intentional from the start. Either way, once discovered, it changed everything. Then there's salt. Not the little shaker on your dinner table, but a mineral so prized it sparked wars and trade routes. You find a salty spring, scoop crystals from its edges, and rub them into your meat. Suddenly you've bought yourself weeks, maybe months, of edible protein. A quirky tidbit: Roman soldiers were partly paid in salt, which is where the word salary comes from. Imagine your boss handing you a pouch of briny crystals instead of a paycheck. Try explaining that to HR. But what if you have no salt, no smoke, only the sun? Drying food is as old as humanity itself. You slice fruit into thin strips, lay them on a flat rock, and let the sun work its slow alchemy. Grapes become raisins, figs become chewy sweetness, and meat turns into jerky tough enough to outlast a season. Anthropologists have found dried fish bones in Egyptian tombs, still preserved after thousands of years, a ghostly snack from another world. Fermentation added another twist. You bury grains in pits, cover them with leaves, and let microbes do their invisible dance. Out comes beer-like gruel, tangy and slightly intoxicating. Early farmers in Mesopotamia may have stumbled on this while trying to store grain, finding that spoiled food was not spoiled at all, but transformed. Some scholars still debate whether humans first domesticated grain for bread or for beer. You can guess which answer most people secretly root for. And then there's fat. Not glamorous, but vital. You boil down marrow and suet, pour it over dried meat and berries, and press it into dense cakes known as pemmican. Indigenous peoples of the North Plains used this superfood for centuries, light to carry and packed with calories. Explorers later relied on it to cross frozen tundra. Quirky fact: one 19th century Arctic expedition carried so much pemmican that sailors joked they'd turn into giant blocks of beef fat themselves. Clay jars, hollowed gourds, and even animal stomachs became early storage containers. You picture yourself filling a skin pouch with dried berries, tying it tight, and burying it under cool soil. Primitive refrigeration. In deserts, people learned to keep food in porous clay pots that sweated water, cooling the contents. It's the same principle behind your modern camping cooler, minus the bright plastic shell. Not everything was practical, though. Some survival methods seem almost absurd. In ancient Egypt, crocodile fat mixed with herbs was smeared on food as a preservative. Historians still argue whether it truly worked or whether it was ritual superstition. But either way, someone had to be the first person brave enough to smear croc goo on their dinner. Sitting there, stomach growling, you realize survival was never just about killing the next meal. It was about stretching, preserving, and inventing ways to cheat decay. Every dried fig, every salted fish, every jar tucked underground was a small act of defiance against hunger. You could wander and starve, or you could plan and endure. And endurance meant power. You reach into your imaginary pouch, pull out a tough strip of jerky, and chew slowly. It's not glamorous, but it's fuel. Enough to carry you into the next day, the next hunt, the next night of firelight. Enough to live. Your belly is settled for now, but another danger lurks in every mouthful, the hidden poison. Out here, surrounded by roots, berries, and fungi, not everything that looks edible is your friend. Primitive survival meant knowing what to eat and what could end you before the next sunrise. You crouch in the dirt, eyeing a patch of plants, and realize the difference between a meal and a death sentence often came down to observation, luck, and stories whispered down generations. You pluck a bright red berry. Looks juicy, tempting, but the old survival saying comes to mind. Bright and shiny often means deadly. Many traditional peoples tested food with ritual-like care. The universal edibility test, used by some tribes and later copied by explorers, went step by step. Touch the plant to your skin. Wait. Touch it to your lips. Wait. Chew a tiny bit. Wait again. A drawn-out game of patience against poison. Historians still argue whether this method was scientific or superstition, but it worked often enough to survive. Take mushrooms. Delicious, yes, but also treacherous. The death-cap mushroom looks a lot like edible cousins. Entire villages in Europe were wiped out after confusing one for another. And yet, people who learned to distinguish the subtle ridges, the smell, the way the cap bruised under a fingernail, passed that knowledge like treasure. Quirky tidbit. In some Slavic traditions, mushroom hunters licked caps to test bitterness, a gamble that sounds more like a dare than survival science. Roots and tubers gave starch, but some hid toxins. Cassava, eaten across Africa and South America, can kill if unprocessed. The trick? Grate it, soak it, ferment it, then cook. Suddenly, deadly root turns into bread, porridge, even beer. It's proof that survival wasn't just about what nature offered, but what you could transform. You imagine the first person bold enough to tinker with cassava, either genius or desperate, maybe both. And then there were leaves. Some soothed, others scorched. Nettle stings on the skin, but becomes rich greens when boiled. Willow bark chewed for pain relief contained the chemical ancestor of aspirin. In the high Arctic, Inuit peoples brewed tea from Labrador leaves, not just for warmth, but for vitamins, warding off scurvy before anyone even knew what vitamin C was. Historians still debate whether these remedies were discovered by chance or by years of systematic trial. Either way, it kept people alive. Animals brought their own risks. Shellfish, for example, can carry toxins invisible to the eye. Ancient coastal peoples learned to sniff, prod, and cook them carefully. Some Polynesian fishermen carried wooden totems carved with patterns reminding them which fish were safe in which season. It was biology disguised as religion, a mnemonic survival code. And then there's the bizarre. In medieval Europe, some people swore by testing food with silver spoons, believing the metal would turn black in contact with poison. Science says it doesn't really work, but it gave peace of mind, until someone keeled over anyway. Sometimes superstition was survival placebo, a false safety net dangling over a cliff. You crouch again over that berry bush. The air smells sharp, earthy. You hesitate. Do you risk it? Ancient survivors might have crushed a berry on their tongue and waited for numbness, burning, or bitter aftertaste. Today you'd Google it, but back then, your life was your search bar. Quirky fact, some nomadic peoples carried animals partly as food testers. Goats, pigs, Even dogs were fed scraps of unknown plants first. If the animal keeled over, the humans politely declined the meal. Primitive, a bit cruel, but undeniably effective. Out here, survival wasn't about bravery, it was about caution. To eat was to gamble. To know what was safe was to carry centuries of inherited wisdom, layered in taste, smell, touch, and ritual. You might live without fire for a night, without tools for a week. But eat the wrong thing, and you wouldn't live at all. You toss the red berry away. Better hungry than poisoned. Tomorrow, you'll look for roots you recognize, leaves you can boil, mushrooms you trust. In the wilderness, restraint itself becomes a survival tactic. Your hunger is managed, your choice is cautious, but thirst is merciless. Water is life, and without it, survival shrinks from weeks to just days. You lick your lips, already dry, and glance around the wilderness. Streams can be muddy, ponds stagnant, rivers teeming with unseen parasites. Primitive survival meant finding water, yes, but more importantly, making it safe enough to drink. You crouch by a shallow pool. The surface shimmers, dragonflies skimming across it. Tempting, but you hesitate. Ancient people knew that not all water was created equal. They sought running streams over still ponds, snow melt over swamp water. Some cultures even listened to birds. Pigeons and doves rarely stray far from drinkable water. Quirky tidbit: desert Bedouins followed ants. If you trace their lines, they often led straight to hidden springs. Once found, the next problem was purification. One of the oldest methods? Fire. Drop hot stones from a fire into a container of water, boiling away threats. If no pot was handy, people dug pits in the ground, lined them with hide, and used heated rocks to turn muddy puddles into steaming safety. Historians still argue whether boiling was universally known or a patchwork of discoveries across different continents. Charcoal came next. Burned wood, crushed fine, turned into a primitive filter. Pour water through layers of sand, gravel, and charcoal, and you had a survival straw before plastic was ever dreamed of. Indigenous peoples across the Americas used this, and archaeologists suspect similar systems cropped up in Asia and Africa independently. Modern science confirms it. Charcoal absorbs toxins and even removes some pathogens. You can almost imagine the satisfaction of that first sip. Cool, clear, transformed. In deserts, survivalists stretched ingenuity to extremes. You dig a shallow pit, cover it with leaves or hide, and wait for condensation to drip into a container, a solar still in its most ancient form. Romans wrote about soldiers digging trenches to collect dew, squeezing droplets from cloaks at dawn. Quirky fact: sailors stranded at sea sometimes chewed on fish flesh for its water content, a grim hydration hack passed through generations. Some survival methods feel more magical than scientific. In medieval Europe, people carried amulets of stones said to purify any stream. Spoiler, they didn't. But in the Andes, chewing certain bitter leaves before drinking may have numbed mouths against contaminated water, offering psychological comfort if not actual protection. Historians still debate whether these were placebo rituals or if some plants genuinely offered mild antibacterial effects. Storage was its own challenge. Skins of goats, bladders of animals, hollow gourds, all became primitive canteens. Nomads in Central Asia carried fermented mare's milk not only as nourishment, but because slightly alcoholic liquids were safer than raw water. You sip, you grimace, but you live. And then ice. For those in colder climates, snow was both a blessing and a danger. Eating snow straight could lower body temperature fatally, so survivors melted it slowly over fire or pressed it into containers against their own body warmth. A delicate balance. thirst quenched without freezing from within. You glance at that shallow pool again. Your reflection stares back, wavering, unsure. You scoop a handful, filter it through grass, let it trickle between your fingers into a leaf. Then you sip cautiously. Primitive? Absolutely. But your body hums in gratitude. Water, the simplest thing, was also the deadliest gamble. Too little and you perish. Too careless and you drink sickness into your blood. Every trick, charcoal filters, stone-boiled pits, dew collection, was not luxury but necessity. You carry the taste of that sip in your mouth as proof. Survival is never about abundance. It's about making the little you have just enough. Your thirst is eased, but as the night deepens, your ears stay pricked. Out there, in the dark, something stirs. You're not the only hungry thing in the wilderness. Primitive survival wasn't just about warmth or food or water. It was about staying alive when something else decided you looked tasty. Protection from predators was one of humanity's earliest obsessions, and it shaped how you slept, how you walked, how you built your world. You glance at your fire. It isn't just comfort, it's a warning sign. Ancient people learned fast that flames kept beasts at bay. Lions and wolves didn't dare creep close when sparks leapt into the air. Fires were left smoldering at the edge of camps, acting as barriers, flickering walls of safety. Quirky tidbit. In some parts of India, herders still leave flaming torches planted around pastures to keep leopards away. Historians still argue whether early humans carried fire into the wild just for cooking, or whether protection from predators was the true spark for constant flames. But fire wasn't foolproof. When you left camp to hunt or gather, stealth and cunning took over. Hunters painted their bodies in mud to mask human scent. Others carried pungent herbs or animal dung to confuse tracking noses. Imagine smearing yourself in rhino droppings before a walk through tall grass. It's survival couture at its finest. Sometimes survival was about the high ground. People chose cliffs, caves, or even treetop shelters to rest at night. In East Africa, evidence suggests early hominids may have dragged branches together to make primitive nests, not unlike great apes today. Elevated sleep meant fewer surprise visits from snakes or cats. Archaeologists debate whether these tree platforms were temporary rests or more permanent homes, but the logic is clear. Up high, you're harder to reach. Traps became another shield. In Southeast Asia, sharpened bamboo stakes hidden in pits could deter tigers as well as rival tribes. Across Europe, ringing camps with thorny branches created living fences, primitive barbed wire. You imagine dragging thorn bushes around your campfire circle, your hands scratched, but your mind a little calmer, knowing you've built a fortress of pain. And then there were guardians, not always human. Dogs, descended from wolves, became the earliest alarm systems. Long before they curled on couches, they barked at danger in the night. Some historians still argue whether dogs first attached themselves to humans for scraps, or whether humans deliberately tamed them for protection. Either way, once at your side, a dog's ears doubled your own. Superstition layered itself into these defenses, too. Some tribes painted protective symbols on cave walls, believing they warded off beasts. In parts of medieval Europe, shepherds wore charms said to repel wolves, even though the wolves probably didn't care about your necklace choice. Quirky fact, Roman farmers smeared wolf dung on their doors, convinced it deterred real wolves. The smell alone probably deterred dinner guests, at least. But even with every precaution, courage was needed. Spears leaned at arm's reach, stones stacked in piles for throwing. Every camp became a miniature arsenal. You picture yourself dozing by the fire, one hand always hovering near a weapon, eyes flickering open at every twig snap. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival programming. And yet, predators were teachers, too. Watching how lions stalked, how wolves coordinated, humans borrowed those tactics for their own hunts. Survival was a mirror, protecting yourself while copying your enemy's strengths. Tonight, the shadows ripple beyond your firelight. A howl rises in the distance, thin and wild. You don't panic. You glance at your fire, feet at a branch, hear the crackle rise. You tighten the circle of thorny branches you've imagined around you. You feel the cool weight of a stone in your palm. This is what survival has always been. A negotiation with the dark, a deal struck between fragile flesh and the beasts waiting in the night. The night passes, restless but safe, and when the dawn spills its gray light over the land, another truth sets in. You can't just fight off predators or gnaw dried meat forever. To really endure, you need tools. Your hands are clever, yes, but soft. They break, they bleed. Stone, bone, and wood became extensions of muscle, and with them, humanity rewrote the rules of survival. You squat by the riverbank, pick up a shard of flint, and turn it in your hand. Sharp, jagged. It can cut sinew, scrape bark, slice skin for meat. Archaeologists trace tools like this back over 2 million years, some so primitive they're just fractured rocks. But still, they worked. Historians still argue whether the earliest tools were made deliberately or discovered by accident. But once you've used a sharp edge, there's no going back. From there, technology snowballed. Hunters shaped spears by fire-hardening tips, thrusting them into prey with a force human teeth could never manage. Later, they lashed sharpened stone to shafts with sinew or plant fiber, creating the first composite weapons. Quirky tidbit: scientists once tested ancient spear replicas on carcasses and found they worked frighteningly well. Paleolithic engineering, sharper than your kitchen knives. Bone tools carved softer things, needles for sewing hides, hooks for fishing, smoothers for working leather. Imagine yourself crouched inside a hide tent, threading sinew through holes pricked in deer skin, patching together a parka against the bitter wind. Without that needle, you'd freeze before the season turned. Wood carried its own ingenuity. Bows bent from yew or elm, strung with twisted gut, turned stored energy into deadly range. With a bow, you could kill from far enough away that the prey never saw you coming. That leap, distance between danger and safety, was a revolution. Anthropologists still debate whether the bow first appeared in Africa or Europe, but once it existed, it spread like wildfire. And tools weren't just for hunting or fighting. They built the structures you huddled in, the baskets you carried berries in, the traps that snared rabbits while you slept. Even a digging stick, sharpened and fire-hardened, gave you access to buried tubers, edible roots hiding under the soil. A simple stick could mean the difference between feast and famine. Sometimes the ingenuity looks almost whimsical. Ancient Australians flaked stone blades so thin they were translucent, then hafted them onto wooden handles with tree resin. Inuit peoples carved bone goggles with narrow slits to block the blinding Arctic glare, a survival invention that looks suspiciously like modern sunglasses. Quirky fact: Otzi the Iceman, frozen in the Alps for over 5,000 years, carried a copper axe so finely made that blacksmiths today still admire its craftsmanship. Imagine lugging a multi-tool through snowstorms before backpacks were even a thing. Tools changed not just what you could do, but how you thought. Suddenly you weren't just surviving, you were shaping the world. Instead of tearing meat with your teeth, you butchered it with blades. Instead of hoping a rabbit passed by, you set a trap to catch it while you worked on something else. Each tool was a promise: less chaos, more control. But even the best tool could betray you. A broken spear at the wrong moment meant starvation. A dull blade made you clumsy and slow. Maintenance became part of the rhythm, resharpening edges, readying sinew, mending baskets. Survival wasn't only invention, it was constant repair. A lesson you probably know from your own life. It's not the flashy gadget that saves you, but the one you actually keep working. You grip that flint shard again, feel its edge nick your thumb. Primitive, yes, but in that sharp glint lies the first spark of human mastery. The wilderness is no less wild, the predators no less dangerous, but with tools, you're no longer just prey. You're something new, a creature who can change the odds. Your hands are armed with tools now, but even with spears and fire, you can't do everything alone. The wilderness is too vast, too relentless. Primitive survival became more than an individual struggle, it became a group project. Band together, and suddenly you're not just prey with sharp rocks, you're a coordinated force. This shift, from lone wanderer to tribe, was one of humanity's greatest survival tactics. You picture a hunting party moving through tall grass. Alone, you'd scare the antelope away. But with 10 people, some drive the herd toward others waiting in ambush. Spears fly in rhythm, shouts echo across the plain, and the animal has nowhere to run. Archaeologists have found ancient kill sites where whole groups worked together to corner mammoths into pits or drive bison off cliffs. Historians still argue whether these hunts were carefully strategized or chaotic stampedes, but either way, they worked. And survival wasn't just about food. In camp, roles split naturally. Some gathered roots and berries, some tended fires, some watched the children or sharpened tools. Quirky tidbit: some anthropologists suggest early grandmothers were vital to human success, not because they hunted, but because their knowledge of edible plants and safe routes gave younger hunters more freedom. It's survival by wisdom, not by muscle. Around the fire, bonds formed. Stories passed knowledge, where the water holes were, what season the herds returned, which mushrooms made you sick. Imagine sitting cross-legged, chewing on roasted tuber, while an elder points to stars above, explaining how they guide you north. That's not just bedtime entertainment. It's GPS, oral Wikipedia, the group's survival archive. Defense was collective, too. One person alone could never fight off a pack of wolves. But a ring of shouting, spear-wielding humans with fire? That turned predators into retreating shadows. Cooperation meant turning vulnerability into strength, soft flesh into coordinated force. Anthropologists debate whether language itself grew from these survival needs. Hunting signals, danger calls, instructions shouted over the wind. And it wasn't all grim necessity. Group survival bred ritual, humor, even music. Drums, chants, laughter, all strengthened bonds. Quirky fact: some Arctic hunting groups whistled to each other through reindeer bones, signaling across frozen tundra. Imagine laughing at a joke whistled in the middle of a blizzard, your spirits lifted while your body froze. Of course, groups had challenges, too. Disputes over food, jealousy, competition. One selfish member could endanger all. That's why early systems of fairness, punishment, and sharing emerged, not lofty morality, but survival math. If one hunter hoarded meat, others starved, and the group weakened. Sharing wasn't kindness, it was insurance. You glance at your imaginary camp now. The circle of people, the smoke rising, the hum of voices. Alone, your fire would flicker small against the dark. Together, it becomes a beacon. You see faces lit orange, hear the crack of firewood, smell fat dripping into flames. Survival feels less like endurance and more like community, like a net holding you above chaos. You lean back, and for the first time, you sense something close to peace. The wilderness hasn't changed. It's still teeth and hunger out there. But with others at your side, you've bent the odds. The lesson is clear. Primitive survival wasn't just about spears, smoke, or jerky. It was about us. Together, fragile humans became something unstoppable. The fire burned steady, your tribe gathered, but the wilderness has no pause button. Storms roll in, rivers rise, winters bite hard. To survive, people didn't just huddle and hope. They adapted, bending nature's chaos into rhythm. Primitive survival meant more than reacting. It meant predicting, planning, even manipulating the world around you. You tilt your head upward. The sky was the first survival calendar. Stars marked migration paths, the moon told tides, and the sun's position tracked seasons. Ancient Egyptians built stone markers that aligned with solstices, guiding planting and harvest. Far away in the Americas, the ancestral Puebloans carved spirals that sunlight pierced at precise times of year. Historians still argue whether these were purely spiritual symbols or highly practical farming tools. But either way, those carvings meant food on the table. Weather signs mattered, too. You sniff the air, feel pressure shift, and know a storm's coming. Shepherds in medieval Europe swore red skies at night promised good weather. Red skies in the morning warned of trouble. Quirky tidbit. Polynesian navigators could detect approaching islands by watching how ocean swells bounced back in subtle patterns, a skill so refined that modern sailors still struggle to replicate it. But prediction wasn't enough. You had to prepare. Floodplains gave fertile soil but demanded defenses. People raised earthen mounds to build homes above water. In Mesopotamia, early farmers dug irrigation canals, turning floods into steady streams. Imagine carving ditches with nothing but wooden spades and sheer persistence, all to make the land obey your hunger. In harsher regions, adaptation looked different. Arctic peoples built snow shelters that turned freezing winds into insulated calm. Desert nomads wore layered robes, not thin clothing, counterintuitively trapping sweat to cool the body. Historians still debate whether these adaptations were discovered by trial and error or passed on from much older traditions. And when nature grew too cruel, humans moved. Seasonal migration was survival in motion. Tribes followed herds, retreated from harsh winters, returned when the land softened. Quirky fact, some groups left stone markers along routes, not as maps, but as messages for those who came later. A pile of rocks might whisper, "Water ahead," or "Turn here." Primitive road signs carved in silence. Adapting also meant transforming risk into resource. Lightning-scorched trees became firewood. Floods left fish stranded in shallow pools. Even disaster carried gifts for those who looked closely enough. Survival wasn't about control so much as cooperation, working with nature's moods rather than fighting them outright. You glance at your own imagined camp. The fire is ringed with stones to keep sparks in. Hides stretch overhead, catching rain before it soaks your bedding. A ditch channels runoff away from your fire. These little acts aren't dramatic. They're quiet, ordinary tweaks. But they're the real key. Primitive survival was not one grand gesture, but countless small adjustments, repeated daily until they became instinct. The storm clouds gather now, thunder rolling low. But you don't flinch. You've read the signs, prepared the camp, stacked firewood high and dug drainage trenches. The wilderness may roar, but you've bent just enough to stand firm. Adaptation has always been humanity's sharpest weapon. The storm passes, leaving the night washed clean, and your firelight flickers against damp earth. Survival, at its core, was never a single tactic. It was a tapestry. Over millennia, humans wove knowledge, trial, failure, and stubbornness into systems that turned wilderness into home. And now, as you sit here with sparks rising into the dark, the echoes of those old strategies hum around you like ghostly advisors. You think of how far people went to keep death at bay. They stitched shelters from bone and hide, hammered tools from stone, mapped the sky for hints of tomorrow. They invented ways to purify water long before science had a name. Quirky fact: some early Andean communities chewed the leaves of certain plants that acted as mild painkillers and stimulants, easing fatigue at high altitudes. Historians still argue whether these were discovered through careful experimentation or sheer, desperate curiosity. And yet, survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about living. Communities told stories, painted walls, sang around fires. That sense of shared meaning stitched resilience tighter than sinew on a bough. Imagine an Ice Age child listening to a story of how their ancestors outran a great beast. Comforting, terrifying, and educational all at once. What makes primitive survival tactics fascinating is how many of them are still with us, hidden in plain sight. You filter water through a modern purifier. Your ancestors did it with sand and charcoal. You wear insulated boots. They used woven grasses or felted fur. Even the humble knot you tie in a shoelace has cousins in seafaring rigging techniques passed down for thousands of years. And the debates continue. Historians still argue whether fire-making spread rapidly through early trade routes or arose independently in scattered corners of the world. They wonder whether those prehistoric cave paintings were survival manuals or spiritual dreams. These mysteries remind you that survival wasn't just mechanical. It was intellectual, creative, even philosophical. Quirky tidbit to carry. In medieval times, peasants often placed slices of onion in boots to ward off frostbite. Modern science may laugh, but maybe, just maybe, some odd little trick worked often enough to become tradition. Survival is stitched with superstition as much as science. You lean back, listening to the fading crackle of your fire, and realize that the forgotten tricks weren't failures of progress. They were the scaffolding that held humanity upright until newer scaffolding could replace it. Survival knowledge is like a relay race. The baton handed from hand to hand across generations, sometimes dropped, sometimes passed perfectly. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, that baton rests lightly in your own palm. Not because you'll need to weave a rabbit snare tomorrow, but because remembering these things ties you closer to every ancestor who once did. Their breath in frosty air, their smoke rising against stars, it all lingers in you. So now, as the journey closes, let the tempo soften. Picture the fire shrinking to glowing embers, their warmth reaching out in long, gentle waves. The noises of the wilderness have quieted, the storm is gone, the branches are still, and the only rhythm left is your own breathing. You've traveled across deserts, tundras, forests, and seas tonight. You've carried stone knives and bone needles, gathered berries with cautious fingers, tasted bitter water made sweet by clever hands. Each forgotten tactic was not just a trick, but a thread tying you back to people who lived fiercely, who adapted endlessly, who dreamed of mornings they might never see but worked to ensure you would. There's comfort in knowing that even in the harshest places, human beings found laughter, ritual, and warmth. That even when everything seemed stacked against them, they carved out enough safety to sing a song or tell a story by firelight. Maybe that's the real secret. That survival is not just about the body, but about the spirit, about the refusal to let fear steal away hope. So as you drift now, let the weight of all that ingenuity and persistence sink beneath your skin. You carry every campfire, every stone tool, every whispered myth. And even though you'll wake in a world of screens and city streets, the heartbeat of those ancient nights still echoes faintly in your own. Let your eyelids grow heavier, let your thoughts blur, and let the fire fade to a quiet glow. The wilderness is still out there, but tonight, you're safe. Good night, traveler. Sweet dreams.